The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in 1962, a simple envelope stamped with the seal of the United States Department of Agriculture. Inside, a notice that would change everything for thousands of small farmers across the Midwest. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, created during the Great Depression to save family farms from bankruptcy, was now implementing new regulations that would drive many of those same farms out of business. How had this happened? How had an agency born from genuine crisis, staffed by people who genuinely cared about rural America, slowly transformed into something that seemed to work against its own founding purpose? The farmers receiving those letters couldn't have known they were witnessing something far more universal than agricultural policy. They were seeing a pattern that haunts every large organization, a drift so predictable that scholars have given it a name: the Iron Law of Bureaucracy. But this isn't just about government agencies. Walk into any large corporation today, one that started with a revolutionary product or a mission to change the world. Spend time in its corridors, listen to the conversations, you'll hear more talk about quarterly reports than quarterly breakthroughs, more energy devoted to internal politics than external impact, more meetings about meetings than meetings about the work itself. It's as if there's an invisible force that pulls organizations away from their original purpose towards something else entirely, something that serves the organization itself rather than the people it was meant to help. Why does this happen? Why do institutions that begin with such clarity of purpose, whether it's feeding the hungry, educating children, or revolutionizing technology, so often end up serving themselves instead? And perhaps more troubling, why does it feel so inevitable? This is Cycles Decoded. Before we explore this question together, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this work reach others who, like you, are seeking to understand these hidden patterns in the quiet hours when the world finally slows down. I'm genuinely curious where you're listening from tonight. Are you falling asleep in Stockholm, letting this wash over you? Settling in Singapore for the night after a long day, on a late shift in Sao Paulo, needing something calm to help you wind down? There's something profound about knowing we're simultaneously exploring this same ancient pattern across time zones, that right now, in all these places, we're asking the same question about why good intentions so often go astray. Share where you're from in the comments, it actually matters to me. And now, let the busy world outside fade away. Let your shoulders drop. There's nowhere you need to be right now except here, listening. What you're about to explore is a pattern that has repeated itself for over a century in every type of organization, in every country. Let us journey together into understanding why even our best intentions seem to follow this same predictable path. In 1911, a young German sociologist named Robert Michels made a discovery that would haunt political science for the next century. He had spent years studying the Social Democratic Party of Germany, an organization explicitly founded on principles of equality, democracy, and worker empowerment. These were people who had dedicated their lives to fighting hierarchy and concentrated power. Yet as Michels watched the party grow, he noticed something disturbing. The leaders who had once slept on factory floors were now staying in fine hotels. The revolutionaries who had preached about the corruption of power were now obsessed with maintaining their own positions. The party that existed to serve workers was increasingly serving itself. Michels documented this transformation with the precision of a scientist and the sadness of a true believer. He watched as democratic procedures gave way to bureaucratic efficiency. He saw how the leadership's knowledge of complex procedures gradually made them indispensable. He observed the subtle ways that revolutionary energy was channeled into organizational maintenance. From this painful observation came his Iron Law of Bureaucracy, the idea that all organizations, regardless of how democratic or mission-driven they begin, will eventually be dominated by a small group of leaders whose primary concern becomes preserving their own power and the organization's survival. But Michels wasn't just describing German political parties. He was identifying something universal, something that would show up decades later in American government agencies, Silicon Valley startups, and humanitarian organizations around the world. The pattern works like this. In the beginning, an organization forms around a genuine need. There's urgency, there's passion, everyone knows why they're there. But as the organization grows, it requires structure. Structure requires rules. Rules require people to interpret and enforce them, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, those people begin to serve the rules rather than the mission. This isn't because they become corrupt or lazy, it's because survival becomes the priority. The organization develops an immune system that protects itself from threats, including the threat of actually fulfilling its original purpose and becoming obsolete. Consider what happened to the March of Dimes. Founded in 1938 by Franklin Roosevelt to fight polio, it mobilized millions of Americans in a crusade against a disease that was paralyzing thousands of children each year. For nearly 2 decades, every dime collected, every volunteer hour contributed, every research dollar spent was laser-focused on one goal: defeating polio. Then, in 1955, Jonas Salk's vaccine worked. Polio was conquered. The March of Dimes had achieved its mission completely and definitively. By the logic of its founding purpose, the organization should have disbanded. Its job was done. Instead, it found new missions: birth defects, premature births, genetic disorders, each worthy cause, but each also a departure from the singular focus that had made the organization so effective in the first place. The March of Dimes had become too valuable to its employees, too important to its donors, too embedded in the medical establishment to simply declare victory and disappear.
This is the Iron Law in action. The organization's survival instinct overrode its mission instinct.
Decades later, economist James Buchanan would provide the theoretical framework for understanding why this happens so predictably. His public choice theory applied economic thinking to political and bureaucratic behavior, treating government officials and organizational leaders not as selfless public servants, but as rational actors pursuing their own interests. Buchanan's insight was devastatingly simple. People don't stop being people when they work for noble causes. They still want job security, career advancement, and professional recognition. They still respond to incentives, and in large organizations, the incentives increasingly reward behaviors that serve the organization rather than its stated mission. A program director gets promoted based on the size of their budget, not the effectiveness of their programs. A department head gains influence by expanding their staff, not by solving problems so completely that their department becomes unnecessary. A bureaucrat achieves security by making themselves indispensable to complex procedures, not by simplifying those procedures out of existence. The tragic irony is that this happens most completely in organizations with the most noble missions. A for-profit company faces market pressure. If it stops serving customers effectively, it loses revenue and eventually fails. But a government agency or non-profit organization often faces the opposite pressure. The worse it performs, the more funding it can justify needing. This creates what Buchanan called bureaucratic drift, the gradual movement away from original purposes toward organizational self-preservation. It's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's how large organizations naturally evolve when they're insulated from the consequences of mission failure. Yet here's the counterpoint that Michels himself acknowledged. Not all bureaucracies drift. Some maintain their mission focus across decades, even centuries. The difference often comes down to what organizational theorists call institutional design, the specific structures and incentives built into the organization from the beginning. Organizations that resist drift typically share certain characteristics. They have clear, measurable goals that can't be easily redefined. They face regular external pressure that keeps them focused on results rather than process. They have leadership succession systems that prioritize mission commitment over bureaucratic skill. And perhaps most importantly, they have mechanisms for self-elimination, ways to declare victory and dissolve when their purpose is fulfilled. The Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, founded in 1855, has maintained its focus on scientific excellence for over a century and a half. Its structure prevents mission drift through a simple mechanism. It must justify its existence to the Swiss Parliament every few years based on measurable research output and graduate employment rates. The institute cannot simply declare itself successful, it must prove it. Compare this to many modern agencies that have no sunset clauses, no external accountability measures, and no clear definition of what success would look like. They become, in Pournelle's terms, entirely devoted to their own survival and growth. But here is the deeper pattern. The Iron Law reveals something profound about human nature itself. We are creatures who adapt to our circumstances. Place someone in a bureaucratic environment, and they will learn to think bureaucratically. Reward them for following procedures rather than achieving outcomes, and they will become procedure-focused. Give them job security that depends on the organization's continued existence, and they will unconsciously work to ensure that existence, even when the original mission has been completed or proven impossible. The Iron Law is not a failure of bureaucracy, it is bureaucracy working exactly as human psychology dictates it must. The question is not how to eliminate this tendency, but how to design systems that account for it from the beginning. And that brings us to a different kind of organization entirely, one that has learned to harness this same human tendency for a completely different purpose. San Francisco, April 1945. Delegates from 50 nations gather in the Opera House, their voices echoing off gilded walls as they debate the charter for an organization that does not yet exist. Outside, the war in Europe has just ended, the Pacific still burns, and in this ornate theater, built for entertainment, men and women are trying to design something unprecedented, a global institution to prevent the world from tearing itself apart again. The document they produce is remarkably focused, 26 pages, 4 primary purposes, stated with wartime clarity: maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation in solving problems, promote respect for human rights. That's it. No mention of climate change, sustainable development, or gender equality. No specialized agencies for education, health, or culture. Just peace, cooperation, and the prevention of another world war. The founders understood something we've forgotten, that an organization built to do everything often ends up doing nothing particularly well. Yet within 3 years, this focused institution begins to multiply. The World Health Organization appears in 1948. UNESCO follows. The International Labour Organization transfers from the defunct League of Nations. Each new agency arrives with its own mandate, its own budget, its own staff who believe passionately in their mission, and each one, inevitably, begins to interpret that mission more broadly than originally intended. Consider UNESCO, established to rebuild education and culture after the devastation of war. Its founding constitution speaks of building peace through intellectual cooperation, through education, science, and culture. A clear mandate, born from the ashes of a conflict that had weaponized knowledge itself. But watch what happens over the decades. UNESCO begins producing reports on media diversity. It creates programs for intangible cultural heritage. It develops frameworks for artificial intelligence ethics. Each expansion makes sense in isolation. Culture connects to media, heritage preservation supports peace, technology shapes education. Yet step back and you see an organization that has drifted far from its core mission of post-war intellectual reconstruction. The pattern repeats across every UN agency. The World Health Organization, created to coordinate international health work, now issues guidance on urban planning and climate policy. The International Labour Organization, designed to improve working conditions, develops programs on migration and social protection that extend far beyond workplace safety. Each agency discovers that its original mandate connects to everything else and therefore encompasses everything else. This is not necessarily corruption or incompetence. Often it's the opposite. It's competent people recognizing genuine connections between their work and broader global challenges. A health official sees how housing policy affects disease transmission. An education specialist understands how economic inequality undermines learning. These connections are real. The drift happens because acting on every real connection leads to mission creep. But there's a deeper dynamic at work, one that reveals itself in the UN's budget documents. In 1945, the entire UN system employed fewer than 1,500 people. Today, it employs over 44,000. The budget has grown from $19 million to over $3 billion annually for the core UN alone, not counting the specialized agencies which add billions more. This growth creates its own momentum. Each new employee needs projects to justify their position. Each department needs initiatives to demonstrate its relevance. Each specialized agency needs to expand its mandate to secure continued funding from member states. The bureaucracy develops an immune system that resists any attempt to narrow its focus. The most telling example may be the UN's approach to peacekeeping itself, its original core mission. In 1945, the founders envisioned the Security Council authorizing military action to stop aggression, backed by forces contributed by member nations. Simple, direct, focused on preventing another world war. Instead, peacekeeping evolved into something far more complex. Today's UN peacekeepers don't just separate warring armies. They build democratic institutions, they train police forces, they monitor elections, they protect civilians, they support the rule of law, they facilitate humanitarian aid, they promote gender equality in post-conflict societies. Each addition makes sense. You can't maintain peace without addressing its underlying causes, but the result is peacekeeping missions that last decades, cost billions, and often struggle to achieve their expanding list of objectives. The mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, established in 1999, now includes 23 distinct mandated tasks, 23 separate things that peacekeepers are supposed to accomplish simultaneously. This expansion reflects a fundamental tension in how institutions respond to complexity. The world of 1945 seemed simpler because the immediate crisis was clear: prevent another global war. Today's crises are interconnected. Climate change affects migration, migration affects security, security affects development, development affects governance. Everything connects to everything else. The UN's defenders argue this interconnectedness justifies the institution's evolution. They point to genuine successes: smallpox eradication through WHO, literacy programs through UNESCO, labor standards through the ILO. They argue that a narrow 1945-era UN would be irrelevant to 2024's challenges, and they're partly right. The world has grown more complex. Global problems require global coordination. The UN system has adapted to address issues its founders couldn't have imagined. But adaptation and drift are not the same thing. Adaptation means evolving your methods to achieve your original purpose more effectively. Drift means gradually changing your purpose until you're no longer sure what you're trying to accomplish. The question is whether the UN system has crossed that line. When an organization's mandate becomes so broad that it encompasses nearly every global challenge, has it become more effective, or has it become less capable of doing anything particularly well? The answer may lie in a surprising statistic. Despite its massive growth, the UN system today prevents fewer interstate wars than it did in its first 2 decades. Not because it's less competent, but because preventing interstate war, its original core mission, now competes for attention and resources with dozens of other priorities that seem equally urgent. This is the bureaucratic paradox in its purest form. An institution created to solve one problem exceptionally well gradually becomes an institution trying to solve every problem adequately. And in that transformation, something essential is lost: a clarity of purpose that made the original mission possible. The delegates in San Francisco understood this intuitively. They kept their charter short not because they lacked imagination, but because they understood that focus is power, that an organization built to do everything often ends up accomplishing nothing that couldn't have been done by someone else. Yet here we are, nearly 80 years later, with a United Nations system that employs more people than many small countries, spends more money than most national governments, and addresses more issues than any institution in human history. Whether this represents evolution or drift, adaptation or mission creep, depends entirely on what you believe the United Nations was supposed to become. December 1975, a laboratory in Rochester, New York. Stephen Sasson, a young engineer at Eastman Kodak, stares at a contraption the size of a toaster. Wires spill from its sides. Circuit boards catch the fluorescent light. He presses a button and captures the world's first digital photograph. The image is grainy, pixelated, barely recognizable. It takes 23 seconds to record a single frame onto a cassette tape. But in that moment, the future of photography is born inside the very company that will refuse to embrace it. This is not a story about technology failing to advance. This is about an organization so committed to its own success that it cannot see the cliff approaching. Kodak didn't miss the digital revolution, they invented it, and then they buried it. For over a century, Kodak had been synonymous with capturing memories. You press the button, we do the rest, promised their 1888 advertising slogan. By the 1970s, they controlled nearly 90% of the film market in the United States. The yellow boxes lined every drugstore shelf. Their processing labs developed billions of photographs each year. The company employed over 145,000 people worldwide, and every single one of them depended on a business model built around selling film. When Stephen Sasson demonstrated his digital camera prototype to Kodak executives, the response was swift and definitive. "That's cute," one manager reportedly said, "but don't tell anyone about it." The reasoning was brutally logical from their perspective. Why would they promote a technology that eliminated the need for film when film generated nearly 2/3 of their profits? Each roll of film cost pennies to manufacture but sold for dollars. Digital photography threatened to make their most lucrative product obsolete overnight. But here lies the deeper tension that haunts every successful organization. The very systems that made Kodak dominant, the manufacturing expertise, the distribution networks, the chemical processing knowledge, became anchors that held them to the past. They had built an empire on silver halide crystals and gelatin emulsions. Their research labs were temples to photochemistry. Their factories were cathedrals of precision manufacturing. To pivot toward digital meant admitting that decades of accumulated expertise might suddenly become worthless. Consider the human dimension of this resistance. Kodak's senior leadership had spent their entire careers mastering the intricacies of film photography. They understood grain structure and color saturation. They knew how to optimize chemical baths and control temperature variations. These weren't abstract business concepts. They were the skills that had elevated them to positions of power within the company. Digital photography operated on completely different principles. It required expertise in sensors and software, compression algorithms, and display technologies. To embrace digital meant acknowledging that their hard-won knowledge was becoming obsolete. The company's organizational structure reinforced this resistance. Kodak was divided into distinct fiefdoms: film manufacturing, chemical processing, paper production, camera design. Each division had its own budget, its own performance metrics, its own incentives. The film division was measured on film sales. The processing division was evaluated on lab throughput. When digital photography threatened these traditional revenue streams, it wasn't just challenging a business model, it was threatening the livelihood of thousands of employees whose careers were built around those legacy systems. Yet Kodak wasn't entirely blind to the digital threat. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, they continued developing digital technologies. They created some of the first digital cameras for professional use. They pioneered image sensors and compression techniques, but these efforts were consistently underfunded and marginalized. Digital projects were treated as interesting experiments, not existential necessities. The company's massive profits from film sales created a cushion that made innovation feel optional rather than urgent. There's a revealing moment that captures this dynamic perfectly. In 1996, Kodak's digital imaging division requested additional funding to accelerate their camera development. The proposal was rejected by senior management, who argued that digital cameras would cannibalize their profitable film business. That same year, the company spent over $1 billion acquiring Sterling Drug, a pharmaceutical company completely unrelated to photography. They were willing to diversify into entirely new industries, but not willing to cannibalize their core business to embrace the future of their own industry. The irony deepens when you examine what Kodak's competitors were doing during this same period. Canon and Nikon, primarily camera manufacturers rather than film companies, embraced digital photography aggressively. They had less to lose from the transition. Their profits came from selling cameras, not film. Sony, an electronics company with no investment in chemical processing, saw digital photography as a natural extension of their existing capabilities. These companies weren't burdened by legacy infrastructure or entrenched interests. They could pursue digital innovation without internal resistance. Some observers argue that Kodak's failure wasn't purely about bureaucratic inertia, that it reflected a reasonable business calculation gone wrong. The company's leadership genuinely believed that digital photography would remain a niche market for professional users, while consumers would continue preferring the quality and convenience of film. They weren't entirely unreasonable in this assessment. Early digital cameras were expensive, complicated, and produced inferior image quality compared to film. The infrastructure for sharing and printing digital photos barely existed. From their perspective in the 1990s, film photography still offered significant advantages. But this market misjudgment was itself a product of organizational blindness. Kodak's research focused heavily on improving their existing technologies rather than understanding how consumer behavior might evolve. They measured digital cameras against film cameras using criteria that mattered to photographers: image quality, color accuracy, archival permanence. They failed to anticipate that consumers might value different attributes: instant gratification, easy sharing, unlimited shots without additional cost. Their expertise in traditional photography became a liability that prevented them from recognizing the appeal of digital's unique characteristics. The consequences of this organizational drift became undeniable in the early 2000s. Digital camera sales began growing exponentially, while film sales collapsed. Kodak's stock price plummeted from over $90 per share in 1997 to less than $10 by 2003. The company that had once employed nearly 150,000 people began massive layoffs. Factories closed, research labs shuttered, the yellow boxes disappeared from store shelves as consumers embraced memory cards and cloud storage. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for bankruptcy protection. The company that had invented digital photography, that had captured humanity's most precious moments for over a century, had been destroyed by its inability to embrace its own innovation. They possessed the technology to lead the digital revolution. They had the resources to dominate the new market, but they could not overcome the gravitational pull of their own success. The Kodak story reveals something profound about how organizations lose their way. It wasn't external forces that destroyed the company, it was internal resistance to change. The very bureaucratic systems that had made them successful, the careful planning processes, the risk-averse culture, the focus on protecting existing revenue streams, became the mechanisms of their downfall. They had built a machine so perfectly optimized for one way of doing business that it could not adapt when the world demanded something different. This pattern echoes across industries and decades. Organizations create structures to manage complexity and reduce risk, but those same structures can become prisons that prevent adaptation when circumstances change. The bureaucracy that once served the organization's mission begins to serve only itself, preserving processes and protecting territories rather than pursuing the original purpose. And by the time leaders recognize the drift, the gravitational pull of established systems has become too powerful to escape. There is a keyboard in front of you right now. Whether you're reading this on a phone, laptop, or tablet, the letters are arranged in a specific pattern, QWERTY, across the top row. You've typed on this layout thousands of times. Your fingers know exactly where each letter lives. But here's what almost no one knows. This arrangement was designed to slow you down. In 1873, Christopher Sholes faced a mechanical problem. His early typewriters jammed when typists moved too quickly. The keys would stick together, creating a mess of tangled metal arms. So Sholes deliberately scattered the most common letter combinations across the keyboard. He forced typists to use both hands awkwardly. He made speed nearly impossible. The QWERTY layout was born as a brake pedal, not an accelerator. By the 1890s, typewriter technology had advanced. The jamming problem disappeared. New keyboards emerged that could increase typing speed by 30% or more. The Dvorak layout, patented in 1936, placed the most common letters under the strongest fingers. Professional typists using Dvorak could reach speeds that QWERTY users found impossible. Yet here we are, 150 years later, still using Scholl's deliberately inefficient design. Why? This is the story that economist Paul David used to introduce the world to a concept that would revolutionize how we understand organizational behavior: path dependency. The idea that once a system chooses a particular path, it becomes increasingly difficult to change course, even when better alternatives exist, even when everyone knows better alternatives exist. David's research revealed something unsettling about human institutions. They don't naturally evolve toward efficiency. Instead, they often become locked into patterns that made sense at one moment in history, but persist long after that moment has passed. The bureaucratic world is filled with organizational QWERTY keyboards, systems that continue to operate according to rules designed for problems that no longer exist. Consider the United States Postal Service. In 1775, Benjamin Franklin designed a mail system for 13 colonies connected by dirt roads and horse-drawn carriages. Mail traveled slowly, so the system prioritized reliability over speed. Post offices became local gathering places. Mail carriers developed routes that could handle weather delays and seasonal obstacles. The entire structure assumed that information moved at the speed of a walking horse. Today we live in an age of instant communication, yet the Postal Service still operates according to many of Franklin's original principles: 6-day delivery schedules, physical sorting facilities, routes designed for horse and buggy accessibility. The infrastructure consumes billions of dollars annually to maintain a system optimized for a world that disappeared 2 centuries ago. But here's where path dependency becomes truly powerful in bureaucratic settings. It's not just about maintaining old procedures, it's about how those procedures create their own momentum. Each year the Postal Service operates according to its current model. It generates new reasons to continue operating that way. Postal workers develop expertise in the existing system. Labor unions negotiate contracts based on current job classifications. Politicians make promises tied to maintaining local post offices. Equipment manufacturers design machinery for existing facilities. Suppliers build relationships around current purchasing patterns. A vast ecosystem of interests crystallizes around the path already chosen. Brian Arthur, an economist at Stanford, studied this phenomenon across multiple industries. He found that once organizations commit significant resources to a particular approach, they create what he called increasing returns to adoption. The more you invest in a chosen path, the more expensive it becomes to switch to alternatives, even superior alternatives. Arthur documented this pattern in technology companies throughout Silicon Valley. He watched as firms would stumble onto a particular software architecture or business model, often by accident. Once they began hiring people who understood that approach, once they built systems around it, once they trained customers to expect it, switching became prohibitively expensive. Not because the original choice was optimal, but because the organization had become structurally dependent on continuing down that path. Aside, this explains why bureaucracies often seem to resist obvious improvements. It's not that bureaucrats are stupid or malicious, it's that the bureaucracy itself has developed antibodies against change. Every procedure creates a constituency. Every budget line item creates a defender. Every established workflow creates expertise that would be devalued by doing things differently. The Department of Veterans Affairs provides a stark example. The VA's disability rating system was designed in 1945 for World War II veterans returning with specific types of combat injuries. Doctors would examine physical wounds, assign percentage ratings, and calculate monthly payments accordingly. The system worked reasonably well for its intended purpose. 75 years later, the majority of veteran disabilities are psychological, neurological, or related to toxic exposures. Conditions like PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and Gulf War syndrome don't fit neatly into categories designed for missing limbs and shrapnel wounds. Yet the VA continues to force these complex conditions into its 1945 framework, creating delays, frustrations, and inadequate care for millions of veterans. Why doesn't the VA simply redesign its system? Because the current system has created its own supporting infrastructure. Thousands of employees have built careers around understanding the existing rating schedules. Software systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars operate according to current procedures. Legal precedents have accumulated around specific interpretations of the rules. Veteran service organizations have developed expertise in navigating the existing system. Insurance companies have structured their policies around VA determinations. Changing the system would require retraining every employee, rebuilding every database, rewriting every regulation, and re-educating every stakeholder. The cost of switching paths has become greater than the cost of continuing down an obviously suboptimal one. Yet path dependency isn't always destructive. Arthur's research also revealed cases where early choices led to beneficial lock-in effects. Some bureaucracies stumbled onto excellent procedures early in their development and then became structurally committed to maintaining high standards. The Federal Aviation Administration's safety culture exemplifies positive path dependency. After several high-profile crashes in the 1960s, the FAA committed to an extremely cautious approach to aircraft certification. They developed redundant testing procedures, multiple approval layers, and conservative safety margins. These processes were expensive and slow, but they worked. Over decades, this safety-first culture became embedded in every aspect of FAA operations. Engineers learned to over-design rather than cut corners. Inspectors learned to delay approval rather than rush decisions. The entire organization developed what safety experts call chronic unease, a persistent worry that something might go wrong. This cultural path dependency has produced remarkable results. Commercial aviation in the United States is now so safe that you're more likely to be struck by lightning than killed in a plane crash. The FAA's early commitment to extreme caution created a self-reinforcing cycle of safety improvements that continues today. The lesson here is subtle but crucial. Path dependency isn't inherently good or bad. It's a fundamental characteristic of how complex organizations operate over time. The question isn't whether bureaucracies will become path-dependent. They will. The question is whether they'll become locked into paths that serve their mission or paths that serve themselves. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why bureaucratic reform is so difficult. Even when everyone agrees that change is necessary, it's not enough to identify better procedures or more efficient structures. Reformers must also account for all the ways the current path has become embedded in the organization's DNA. They must find ways to make the new path more attractive than the accumulated investments in the old one. This is why successful bureaucratic reform often requires external pressure, crisis moments, or generational turnover. Sometimes it takes a shock to break the gravitational pull of established procedures and create space for new paths to emerge. The QWERTY keyboard remains with us not because it's optimal, but because the cost of coordination required to switch to something better exceeds the benefits of staying put. Every bureaucracy faces similar calculations every day in ways both large and small, and most of the time, inertia wins. The morning of January 28, 1986, 73 seconds after liftoff, the Space Shuttle Challenger breaks apart against a clear blue sky. 7 lives lost, a nation watching in horror, and in the months that followed, investigators would uncover something almost as devastating as the disaster itself. NASA had become an organization that could no longer hear its own engineers. The Rogers Commission found that engineers at Morton Thiokol had warned repeatedly about O-ring failures in cold weather. They had data, they had concerns, they had pleaded for delays, but their voices had been filtered through layers of management, diluted by competing priorities, and ultimately silenced by an organization that had drifted far from its original mission of safe human spaceflight. Yet what happened next offers one of the most compelling examples of how bureaucratic drift can be reversed, how institutions can remember what they were meant to be. NASA's transformation began with a simple recognition. The agency had to choose between its public relations timeline and its engineering reality. Under new leadership, they chose engineering. Flight schedules were rebuilt around safety margins, not media events. Engineers were given direct access to decision-makers. The infamous go fever that had pushed launches forward despite warnings was systematically dismantled. But the most profound change was cultural. NASA instituted what they called normalization of deviance training, teaching every employee to recognize when small compromises accumulate into catastrophic failures. They created anonymous reporting systems. They rewarded dissent. They made it safe to say no. The results speak for themselves. The Space Shuttle program flew 87 more missions after Challenger, with only one additional loss, Columbia, in 2003, which led to another round of reforms and the eventual safe completion of the shuttle era. Consider how radical this transformation was. An organization that had become deaf to its own expertise learned to listen again. A bureaucracy that had prioritized image over substance reversed its priorities. It took a tragedy, yes, but it also took sustained commitment from leadership who understood that drift is not inevitable. There is another story, quieter but no less remarkable, that unfolded across an ocean and over a decade. In 1997, Britain's National Health Service was failing its founding mission, created in 1948, to provide healthcare free at the point of use. The NHS had become something else entirely, a maze of competing priorities, internal markets, and bureaucratic procedures that often seemed to exist for their own sake rather than for patients. Waiting lists stretched for months. Hospitals competed with each other rather than collaborating. Administrators spent more time managing budgets than improving care. The original vision of Anna and Bevan, healthcare based on need, not ability to pay, had been buried under layers of management consultancy and market mechanisms. Tony Blair's government faced a choice: accept the drift or fight it. They chose to fight, but their approach offers a masterclass in how to reform without destroying. The Blair reforms began with a simple question: what would it look like if every decision in the NHS was made with the patient at the center? Not the budget, not the bureaucracy, not the political timeline, the patient. They introduced patient choice programs that allowed people to select their treatment location and timing. They created direct booking systems that bypassed administrative gatekeepers. They established patient advocacy services with real power to challenge clinical decisions. Most importantly, they tied funding directly to patient outcomes rather than bureaucratic processes. The National Institute for Clinical Excellence was created to ensure that medical decisions were based on evidence, not habit or cost-cutting. Waiting time targets were set not as bureaucratic goals, but as promises to real people in real pain. And perhaps most surprisingly for a government initiative, it worked. Between 1997 and 2007, NHS waiting times fell dramatically. Patient satisfaction scores rose consistently. Clinical outcomes improved across virtually every measurable category. The bureaucracy hadn't been eliminated, it had been realigned with its original purpose. But here lies the deeper lesson of both NASA and the NHS. Successful reform requires more than good intentions or even good policies. It requires what organizational theorists call sustained institutional memory. Both organizations created systems to remember why they existed. NASA established safety review boards that couldn't be overruled by schedule pressures. The NHS created patient experience teams that reported directly to hospital boards. They built institutional mechanisms to resist future drift. Yet even these success stories come with important caveats. NASA's post-Challenger reforms prevented shuttle disasters, but couldn't prevent the Columbia tragedy 17 years later. The NHS improvements under Blair were partially reversed by subsequent governments with different priorities. This reveals something crucial about bureaucratic drift. It's not a problem you solve once, it's a tendency you must continuously resist. Like entropy in physics, drift toward dysfunction is the natural state. Alignment with purpose requires constant energy and attention. The most successful reforms share three characteristics. First, they begin with crisis or leadership change that creates space for fundamental questioning. Second, they focus on measurable outcomes that connect directly to the original mission. Third, they create institutional mechanisms to maintain focus over time, even as leadership changes. Consider the European Space Agency's approach to mission drift. After watching NASA's struggles, they built rotation requirements into senior positions, ensuring that no manager stays long enough to become insulated from the organization's core purpose. They require regular mission alignment audits where every department must justify its activities in terms of space exploration and scientific discovery. Or look at Singapore's approach to civil service reform. They created a permanent challenge function within government, teams whose job is explicitly to question whether agencies are serving their intended purpose or simply perpetuating themselves. These teams have real power and report directly to senior political leadership. The pattern is clear. Successful reform isn't about eliminating bureaucracy, it's about remembering what bureaucracy is for. It's about creating systems that can hear their own contradictions and correct course before crisis forces change. But perhaps the most surprising finding from studying these reforms is this: the organizations that successfully countered drift didn't just return to their original missions, they often discovered purposes they hadn't fully understood before. NASA's post-Challenger focus on safety culture led to innovations in risk management that transformed not just spaceflight, but aviation, nuclear power, and medical device manufacturing. The NHS's patient-centered reforms revealed possibilities for preventive care and community health that hadn't been visible when the focus was on treating illness rather than promoting wellness. This suggests something profound about institutional purpose. It's not static. The best organizations don't just resist drift, they evolve their understanding of why they exist, while maintaining fidelity to their core mission. Consider how awareness of bureaucratic drift can inspire proactive measures to maintain alignment with original missions. The most powerful insight from these success stories isn't that drift can be reversed, it's that drift can be anticipated and prevented. The organizations that thrive are those that build resistance to drift into their very structure, creating systems that continuously ask the essential question, are we still who we meant to be? If this exploration of institutional renewal has resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this work reach others who are searching for understanding of how organizations can stay true to their purpose in a world that constantly pulls them toward compromise. I'm genuinely curious about your own experiences with institutional change. Have you witnessed an organization successfully reform itself? What made the difference between cosmetic change and real transformation? Your insights in the comments help us all understand these patterns more deeply. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the cycles of bureaucratic drift and renewal on Cycles Decoded. Until we explore together again, may you find clarity in complexity and rest in the knowledge that even the most entrenched patterns can change when we understand them clearly enough. I wish you a peaceful and restorative night.